Is Trump mentally unfit to be president? That is an awkward question, but it's one that's being asked on every major news network in America.
President Trump's fitness for office is now the top story in the country.
Reports suggest that even Trump's advisors are worried about it.
Everyone around the president questions his intelligence and fitness for office.
100% of the people around him.
Concerns have gotten so bad that Trump agreed to be screened for dementia as part of his last health exam. None of this has to do with Trump's political positions. They have to do with his ability to understand the world around him and make good decisions.
Everybody wants to know, is this president of sound mind?
And if talking about this kind of thing makes you uncomfortable, wait till you see how much it's stressing out actual mental health experts.
In a series of tweets, the president insisted that he is like really smart and a very stable genius.
Last October, a group of 27 mental health experts published this book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. In it, they warned that Trump's behavior shows him to be dangerously unstable, describing him as a pathological narcissist who's delusional, suffers from paranoid ideation, lacks conscience and empathy, and exhibits a host of destructive and dangerous psychiatric symptoms. Yeah, it's rough. 2 months after its publishing, the book's editor met with 12 US senators to talk about Trump's mental fitness. That editor's name?
It's Dr. Bandy Lee. I am a forensic psychiatrist at Yale School of Medicine and an internationally recognized expert on violence.
Since the book came out, Dr. Lee has become kind of the face of mental health experts warning about Trump.
We express our consensus view that Mr. Trump is a danger to national and international security. Some of the psychological signs are impulsivity, recklessness, paranoid reactions, having a loose grip on reality, lacking empathy, having rage reactions. All of these are highly associated with violence.
This week's chaos in the Trump administration is by now unsurprising and was, in effect, predicted by the new book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president, edited by Bandy Lee, MD, a psychiatrist. The book includes and validates some of the general news media's speculation about Donald Trump's mental capacity.
He is emotionally driven, not obviously intellectually driven. You don't even want to use that word with regard to Trump. And I absolutely believe that any decision he makes is going to be primarily influenced by the intensity of the emotion he happens to be feeling at that moment.
Which includes personal feeling about the person he's dealing with, whether he likes that person or not.
You know, it isn't about liking the person, because Donald Trump doesn't like people. What he does is he sees them as useful or not useful, and he sees them as mirroring him and supporting him or opposing him and diminishing him.
I want to go to just one entry in the book. This is Henry Friedman, Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, on the role of Donald Trump's cabinet relevant to this week's Tillerson story. He says, a paranoid, hypersensitive, grandiose, ill-informed leader such as Donald Trump, who has surrounded himself with a cabinet and set of advisors who either are unable to bring him out of his paranoid suspicions and insistencies, or worse, identify with his positions, represents a multi-dimensional threat to our country and the world. And Dr. Lee, when a psychiatrist sees this that way, that's the definition of the duty to warn.
Exactly. The Goldwater rule itself, which is the ethical guideline not to diagnose a public figure in the open, falls under the ethical principle that we participate in activities that promote public health and public mental health. And so when silence contributes to harm to the public health, then we do have a duty to speak out, and the duty to warn and the duty to protect.
As far back as July 16, I was saying, made me think that he could, in an impulsive, angry moment, punch in the nuclear codes with nobody between him and our destruction.
Dr. Bandy Lee and Tony Schwartz, thank you very much for joining us. The book is The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, and this is an historic work in the history of American psychiatry.
A bill on Capitol Hill that could start a formal process to evaluate any president's mental fitness is getting more interest, with 56 co-sponsors, all Democrats. The Democrat who introduced the bill joins me now, Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland. Congressman, thanks so much for being here. You and several of your Democratic House colleagues met with a psychiatry professor from Yale, Dr. Bandy Lee. She told CNN today, quote, As the president is unraveling, he seems to be losing his grip on reality and reverting to conspiracy theories. There are signs that he is going into attack mode when he is under stress. That means he has the potential to become impulsive and very volatile, unquote. Did she say that to the assembled congresspeople?
Well, I think that Dr. Lee and other psychiatrists who've been up to meet with members of Congress have been predicting increasingly delusional and paranoid behavior on the part of the president. Of course, we're not mental health professionals, we're not psychiatrists, that's not our role, but we do have a very defined and important role under the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, which is to set up a body that could act with the vice president in the event of an emergency when the president becomes unable for mental or physical reasons to successfully discharge the powers and duties of office.
Sure,
so the bill just sets up the body that would be able to go to work if there were a real crisis.
But I guess one of the concerns would be a lot of these mental health experts, and we've seen them weighing in the New York Times and on cable TV and elsewhere. There was something set up in the mental health community called the Goldwater Rule, deeming it unethical for any mental health professional to give a professional opinion on a public figure who he or she did not personally evaluate. How could she say such a thing without examining the president?
Well, they're not violating the Goldwater Rule, which is incorporated into a lot of state bodies of law governing mental health practitioners, because they're not making a specific diagnosis under the DSM of the president. As I understand what they're doing, they're acting the way that any citizen has a right to act under the First Amendment, to say that they think that the president is dangerous and unable to successfully meet the powers and duties of office. And that's the constitutional standard.
Well, that's a terrible lack of empathy. It shows, as in the most recent instance in Puerto Rico, a complete incapacity to feel what they're feeling and to protect them in the way that our government is supposed to.
Let me add one more. How about the inability to ever admit you were wrong, even if you have changed a position? What does that indicate?
Well, profound denial, a rigidity, a kind of preference for one's self-importance and delusions of one's perfection over the reality.
You know, on the radio, many of our callers ask the question or posit the notion that Donald Trump is mentally ill. You assert that that's not the right question. That's not the relevant. Why is that not the right question?
Well, there are a number of reasons. One, being mentally ill is not a disqualification for high office. Just think about Abraham Lincoln and Winston
suffered from
Churchill.
Depression.
Exactly. Great leaders. Second of all, having a mental illness isn't what we're talking about. We're talking about functional impairment, somebody who can't process information, who can't make subtle, nuanced discriminations, who can't consult other people, but who gets overwhelmed by his own personal insecurity and urgency and has to lash out impulsively and vindictively.
Are you just describing the president in those last couple of sentences?
I'm describing my experience of the president, yeah.
As an expert on violence, I can tell you that previous violence shows an indication for possible future violence, and he has already shown verbal aggressiveness, history of sexual assault, incitement to violence at his rallies, endorsement of violence in public speeches, and he's shown an attraction to violence and powerful weapons, as well as he has taunted hostile nations with nuclear power. All these things are signs of danger. It's really an unprecedented event that such a large number of mental health professionals have come forth about their concerns about any president.
The group that you're a part of, the psychiatric group, you're a contributor to a book called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. What are some of the key concerns about Trump that you and your colleagues raise?
Well, I wrote a letter together with Judith Herman to the New York Times in which we raised two issues. One was his relation to reality, which is I would say solipsistic and untenable and very dangerous to everyone.
What do you mean solipsistic?
Solipsistic from within the self. In other words, he only sees the world from within his sense of self. He can't have empathy for others. He can't really think into the future, the consequences of his actions, because he's totally preoccupied with the immediate event and how he can deal with it or manipulate it as emerging through the perception on the part of his sense of self. That's very extreme. People who are psychotic behave that way, and yet for the most part, Trump is not psychotic. That combination makes him really dangerous.
CNN political analyst Carl Bernstein, the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist who helped break the Watergate story, is here with me. It is so good to have you back.
Be with you.
Just even listening to the vice president struggling there, right, in responding to what the president had said last week. The president up tonight, you know, in the midst of this credibility crisis. What do you think?
His whole presidency is a credibility crisis because he traffics in misinformation, lying, and disinformation. And that is the hallmark of this presidency. And it's increasingly why Republicans, not just Democrats, are losing confidence in the President of the United States and wonder how long this kind of lying can go on to the American people. There's never been anything like this.
He has flirted recently publicly about declaring a national emergency. Do you think he goes there tonight?
I wouldn't predict anything Donald Trump does or doesn't do, but I think we need to identify the real national emergency in this country, and that is the question of whether or not Donald Trump is fit to be the President of the United States. And increasingly, we are hearing from Republicans, Democrats, journalists, citizens, on the basis of real hard information, why it may be that a consensus is developing that Donald Trump is unfit to be President of the United States because of his actions in obstructing justice, because of what we just saw in Syria, because of his ignorance on foreign policy, because of his putting his self-interest and that of his family ahead of the national interest. But above all, the lying. We've never been confronted with this kind of consistent dishonesty. Nixon was a criminal president. We've never been confronted with this kind of consistent dishonesty in terms of the president projecting a public debate that is based from the beginning of his presidency through today. Look indeed what he's tried to do, the pretzel he got himself into trying to explain the Russians in Afghanistan with no understanding of the history of his own time and hasn't bothered to do the work. That's one reason that Mattis, Tillerson, and others came to the conclusion that we have a national emergency. The national emergency is not the wall, it's Donald Trump.
At times of tragedy, people look to their leaders. We've obviously looked at the president's reaction to the man sending the pipe bombs, to the attack in the synagogue. What is your take on all of this?
Most presidents in a moment of crisis like this, especially with such a huge emotional element, you know, most of us are hurting. They heal, they unite, they inspired. You know, it's not exactly rocket science. You look all the way through American history. That's what presidents do. It's not in Donald Trump's software to do this. He's a one-trick pony. His single political MO is to try to divide and conquer, to pit groups against one another and benefit from it politically, even after a tragedy like what happened on Saturday. What other president in our history, Stephanie, would have made those jokes he did about his hair, would have gone on with this political rally just a few hours after this happened? It gets to empathy. You know, one of the things that we ask from a president is to have a little bit of empathy. When Abraham Lincoln was waging the Civil War, you know, he said to a friend, "Can you imagine that I, who cannot even bear to watch a chicken being slaughtered, I'm responsible for oceans of blood?" Lincoln said when he was asked to build a national cemetery, he said, "I'd put it near my summer house so that I will see it every single day, so that I'll be confronted by those graves being dug, and I will remember the results of the terrible decisions I'm making."
Wow. There are people who are questioning whether the president's rhetoric, the division that he has caused, could be partially to blame to incite this kind of violence. A Washington Post reporter writes, "The fact that Trump's rhetoric is without compare in American politics makes that a logical question."
He's been doing it. It's been right before our eyes. You know, we all saw that rally when he was inciting people, you know, in the arena during the campaign to violence. He's done it all the way through. You do not throw matches on kerosene if you're the kind of president that we were lucky enough to have for most of America.
He also knows the white nationalist movement, so he could have used many other words besides a nationalist.
To a lot of people, the word nationalist means white nationalist. In history, oftentimes, There was a man named George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the head of the American Nazi Party, who was killed in the 1960s. And Rockwell wrote a book called The Nationalist Perspective. And guess what he was referring to?
Clearly illegal what the president is doing. You know, that's the legal argument. I think we need to understand why we're in this situation.
It was clear to my fellow doctors and to fellow scientists and to just concerned people that there was something seriously the matter.
I'm concerned about many things about his mental instability, but especially in the immediate present, I'm most worried about his unfettered authority to launch nuclear weapons.
We also can understand psychopathology, this idea of a feeling that one has the right to do whatever they desire to do. We also see the idea of, talk about obsession and compulsive behavior being played out.
There are people who lie all the time and don't know it. Confabulation is when someone tells you something that's absolutely wrong and they firmly believe it to be true. This happens a lot with people with neurologic disease. When you see someone who lies all the time, you say, what could be wrong with that person? Is this a personality problem? Or is this a brain problem? Is it getting worse?
We feel generally that there should be a more extensive kind of examination of American presidents or potential American presidents, and especially in relationship to their potential response to an extreme crisis, such as nuclear threat.
Trump has his finger on the triggers of 3,000 or 4,000 nuclear weapons. It's clear that if he even took one step in that direction, he could turn the world wars and the genocides of the 20th century into minor footnotes in the history of human violence. We can see a level of violent destructiveness on this earth that we've never seen before.